Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we will get to as many of them as we can. Allow me now to introduce our guest host, Professor Rajan Menon. He directs the Grant Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. He is a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University in New York. He's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Professor of International Relations at the Powell School, City College of New York, City University of New York. He is a prolific writer, most recently the Conceit of Humanitarian Intervention from Oxford University Press. His articles and essays have been published by almost all the leading global media, including the Financial Times, the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and I could go on. Please welcome on Polaris Live your host today from New York, Professor Rajan Menon.
Thank you, Kishore, for that very generous introduction. Welcome to our loyal audience at Polaris Live. We have today a very big topic: the United States, China, India, and the world. We will focus primarily on Asia, but it's still a very big topic. Luckily, we have two of the world's preeminent thinkers, not just on Asia, but on international affairs generally. And let me introduce them in turn. Ambassador, now Professor Shivshankar Menon, hails from a renowned diplomatic family in India. He is widely recognized as among India's most accomplished and respected diplomats. He served as High Commissioner or Ambassador for India in China, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and Israel, countries that are, of course, extremely important to India. He served as Foreign Secretary in the Indian government and also as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. He is now a visiting professor and chair of the Center for China Studies at Ashoka University. Shankar is a prolific writer. Among his books are India and Asian Geopolitics and The Making of Indian Foreign Policy. And in case you're wondering, audience, why there are two Menons on this program, let me just note that Shankar is also my cousin. So there's a familial tie, and therefore it's both a professional and personal pleasure to welcome you, Shankar. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Rajan, and thank you for that very flattering introduction.
Our next guest, no less illustrious, is Ambassador, now Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore spent 34 years in Singapore's Foreign Service and came to be known as one of Singapore's stellar diplomats. He's held senior positions on behalf of the Singapore government in Cambodia, in Malaysia, in Washington, D.C., in New York, and was on two occasions Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. Very quickly established himself as a man of wit and wisdom and great knowledge. Since 2014, he has been a distinguished academic, the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and now a distinguished fellow at the Asian Research Institute. Kishore is a controversial figure in the best sense of the word, as witnessed the title of two of his best-known books, Can Asians Think? And Has China Won? Both Kishore and Shankar have been recognized by Foreign Policy magazine as among the world's preeminent thinkers. So let's dive in, gentlemen. What, in your opinion, does China want in Asia and from Asia? Shankar, maybe you could open up.
Well, can't answer for China and for what China wants, whether it's primacy, dominance, or a remade Asian and global order, uh, partly because China seems to recognize the limits of her power better than others do. In practice, China has been careful, calibrating its use of force not to provoke kinetic responses, staying just below the threshold of starting conventional conflict, while complicating and changing US, Japanese, Indian, other calculuses, and achieving political ends. Uh, in this respect, she's been much cleverer in the political uses of her power than, say, Russia in the Ukraine. Take the South China Sea, for instance. Since 2008, China's militarized and built up islands, but those were islands or rocks that she had already occupied. She hasn't evicted anyone from other islands and has not enforced her claims to this territorial sea except verbally. The exception, of course, is the deaths on the India China border in 2020. So, you know, while there have been crises as a consequence of China's rise, it's an interesting situation that there has not so far been direct conflict between the powers. And China seems to have tried to avoid that, certainly with the US and with Japan, while expanding her power and influence. Maybe because of her economic dependence on the US and Japan. To me, that suggests that she'll continue this sort of cautious but assertive policy. But, that doesn't mean that mistakes can't occur. I mean, the Chinese are human too.
Kishore, your take on this?
Well, first, thank you very much for including me in this 3M show, the Menon Mahbubani show.
I hadn't thought of that. Yes, indeed.
And it's such a pleasure to join both of you. I want to begin by saying that I, of course, agree with everything that my good friend Shankar has just said. But if you ask me what does China want, I would point to three things. Number one, I think to understand the Chinese psyche, it's very important to know that China went through a century of humiliation from 1842, the Opium War, when the British humiliated China, right up to 1949, when the People's Republic of China was set up. So I think what happened then is still sort of very powerfully etched into Chinese minds. And the first thing they want is they'll say, never again shall we suffer such humiliation. So overcoming humiliation is the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that China can see very clearly that even though China has progressed and advanced a great deal, in fact, the past 40 years of development in China have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history, still China is way behind the modern middle-class societies that the West has today. And so the second thing that China wants is to achieve the same standard of living of most modern middle-class societies. So right now, their per capita income is about $10,000 US dollars per head. If they can get to 30 or 40,000, I think they'll be very happy, because then they'll be on par with the rest of the world. And I would say the third thing that China wants is to ensure that it has a respected place in a stable international order. And I would emphasize two words: respect and stability. That they want to be treated with respect, especially by the United States. And they also want a stable order. Now, of course, there's a huge discussion, as you know, in the American media as to whether or not China is acting in conformity with a rules-based order or not. Actually, I do believe that Chinese want a rules-based order, because the one thing that the Chinese hate domestically and globally is chaos. So the more stability there is in the world, the more rules there are in the world, the more comfortable they are.
You both know the American foreign policy debate about China very well. You've got good friends in the United States. You've spent a lot of time in the United States. There's one line of thinking that is contrary to the views that you've both enunciated, that China is not, in fact, careful. It is an expansionist and, if need be, even a reckless power. And that ultimately its ambitions in Asia and more generally globally, are so capacious that they cannot be achieved without periodic crises with the United States, perhaps India, perhaps Japan, and perhaps even outright conflict. Now, you know some of the people associated with this view in no particular order: Graham Allison of the Harvard Kennedy School, Neil Ferguson of the Hoover Institute, and Kishore, our good friend, John Mearsheimer. What is your take on this particular perspective? And I'll start this time with you, Kishore.
Well, I mean, of course, both Graham Allison and Mearsheimer are friends of mine, and I'm familiar with their views. I would say that Graham acknowledges that the United States can live with China and can work with China, whereas Mearsheimer has a more dark and pessimistic view. And sadly, our friend Mearsheimer, as you know, has been marginalized after his views on saying that the Ukraine war could have been prevented. And in some ways, I think Mearsheimer is right, but he's been marginalized because of what he said down there. But to answer your question directly, the main theme of my book, Has China Won, is that the United States is making a major strategic mistake in launching a geopolitical contest against China without working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And as I say in my book, that insight was given to me by Henry Kissinger at a lunch. And the key point to note here is that if the United States does try to work out a long-term strategy, it is conceivable for both United States and China to work together in a win-win arrangement whereby the standard of living of both their peoples go up, and at the same time both can come together to deal with common global challenges like climate change, and today, as you know, like inflation, like global food shortages. There's so many common global problems that we face that actually there are far greater reasons for the United States and China to cooperate with each other rather than to try and destroy each other in the way that they seem to be doing now. Now, having said that, let me also acknowledge, as I do in my book, that no great power cedes its number one position gracefully to the number two power. And so, sometime within the next 10 years, China will become the number one economic power and the United States will become number two. And this is something that the United States will try very hard to resist. So, even though I believe you can have an optimistic outcome for the next 10 years, the United States will do whatever it can to thwart China's rise, and therefore we'll have a difficult 10 years in US China relations.
So, Kishore, before I go to Shankar, let me just press you a little bit on this. We've had at least one handover from a dominant power to the other that happened relatively peacefully. Pax Britannica yielding to Pax Americana. The view is that the shift, whenever it happens from Pax Americana to Pax Sinica, if indeed it comes about, cannot occur peacefully because the two countries are fundamentally different culturally and politically and in terms of historical experience, and that a country that is of China's size, over 1 billion, that has now become the world's largest economy, $27.3 trillion, according to the World Bank, versus 23 or so for the United States and about 10.9 trillion for India. It's also got substantial military muscle. The United States is far and away the world's largest spender on defense, but $778 billion, but China is up there with 255 billion, and closing the gap. That if you put all of these things together, this is an ingredient at some point. These are ingredients for something approaching a train wreck, particularly on the sensitive issue of Taiwan. Your thoughts on this, Kishore, before I go to Shankar?
Well, you're absolutely right that the transition from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana was a peaceful one, but there are many reasons for that. I mean, partly because the British had no chance whatsoever of retaining the number one position when the United States became very strong and powerful. But another reason was a cultural reason, right? And it was much easier for the British, an Anglo-Saxon country, to cede power to another Anglo-Saxon country in the hope that they could work with the United States. And by the way, it ended up, frankly, with the British and United States working happily together in the first 50 years of the 20th century, fighting two wars together, World War I and World War II. The difference today, of course, is that when you deal with China, there's a factor that most Americans don't want to mention, which is the fear of the yellow peril. Now, one thing I assert in my book, Has China Won, is that the fear of the yellow peril is not a piece of fiction. It's actually lain buried in the Western imagination for 800 years since the Mongols almost conquered Europe. And I believe that also explains the very strong emotional reactions in the United States to China. But I also believe that because these are emotional reactions, they're not well-informed reactions to China, because I believe the United States tries to understand China better. And if the United States reads Henry Kissinger's book called On China, they will find that the Chinese actually, more than any other country in the world, appreciate stability more than chaos. And if you can create a rules-based order which gives enough space for China to grow and develop, and nowadays, by the way, this is not like the 19th century or 18th century or even the first half of the 20th century where everything is a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. With modern technology, Chinese people can grow and thrive, and United States people can grow and thrive, and they can both do equally well. But you do need an overriding rules-based order which constrains China and constrains United States of America. And I think that's what the West should be trying to do: strengthen the multi-rules-based order to ensure that the China that emerges as number one is one that plays by the same rules as everybody else. And I think that can be done.
Shankar, your view on this: can a country that is growing at the rate that China is and has such outsized ambitions, and I don't mean that in a negative way, can the transition from a US dominated world to a Chinese dominated world occur more or less seamlessly?
I'm not so sure that we should make that assumption that that transition is happening or will happen. China's growth has slowed. There's a whole set of other things happening around the world, which I think throw many of the assumptions that we might have made 5 years ago about power transition and so on into question. China's own demography, the fact that she's in a crowded neighborhood, and you've seen reactions to China's rise among neighbors, among other countries, and the US, of course. So I'd be a little careful about just assuming that this is inevitable. In fact, China's trajectory to me is an open question. This is a government that still spends more on internal security than it does on national defense. And presumably the Chinese leaders know something more about their own society than we do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing this. As for China's ambitions, again, her commitment to order, she's also traditionally been committed to hierarchy and to a very hierarchical view of the world, and has told herself an imagined past, especially now, of a century of humiliation, but that before that China was number one in the world, and that this was the normal order of things, and therefore all she's doing is trying to go back to a normal order of things. But it hasn't always been a stable order that she has sought. Traditionally, in history, or even in the recent past, China was for a long time after the founding of the People's Republic of China, a revolutionary power. And today she is still a revisionist power. She wants to change the order. That's revisionism. That's not a stable order that she's seeking. So for me, therefore, there are too many moving pieces in this situation today for us to say clearly that there is a power transition which will take place, and therefore will it be peaceful or not. Many of the people you mentioned as worrying about the nature of that transition, Graham Allison, for instance, his last chapter is actually all about how to avoid the transition not being peaceful. As I said to him once, You should have put a question mark at the end of the title, Destined for War, but with a question mark. Kevin Rudd's just written a book about the avoidable war, and again, how to avoid China and the US getting into conflict. So, and the trouble is for the rest of the world, frankly, when they look at both Chinese behavior and US behavior, both China and the US say they want a stable order, they want a rule-based order, but neither of them seems to apply it to their own actions. Their actions in this century don't prove their commitment to any rule-based order. It seems to be order for other people rather than for themselves in terms of constraining what they do. I don't want to get into all the examples, but there are several. So given that, I'd be a little more careful about that. And for me, therefore, the answer to your question is, I think we are between orders right now. I think we cannot, therefore, make big assumptions about where we'll be 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And therefore, let's deal with the immediate problems that we have. We have enough on our plates. We have climate change, we have pandemic, we have an economic recession coming, according to all the people who seem to know. And we have a huge developing country debt crisis around us. And so in this situation, I don't see how either China or the US can see smooth sailing for themselves in the global situation. So what I actually see is a fragmentation of the world and of each one turning inwards, concentrating on what they're doing at home, strengthening themselves. You've seen the world's greatest arms race in history in the Asia-Pacific over the last 2 decades, led by China, but also by other countries. You've seen the increasing militarization. You've seen security dilemmas across maritime Asia on China's periphery. So we have a situation here which for me is much more uncertain, much more, well, inflammable than it was, say, 10 years ago. And where if we start assuming that there's a power transition which is going to be completed and so on, I think we'll make major mistakes in dealing with the immediate issues that face us.
Just to follow up, Shankar, and I'll get to you in a second, Kishore, there's a tendency to view China in the United States, anyway, at least, as a power that is out to supplant the United States, that's all-seeing and all-knowing and has got a perfect game plan. But as you pointed out, they have several speed bumps to contend with: an aging society, a declining economic growth, although still very respectable by global standards. And then the most recent speed bump has been the effect on China's economic growth, and therefore that of Asia and other parts of the world, on the zero COVID policy, where they've insisted on lockdowns, refused to license in a timely fashion Western mRNA vaccines, and so on. Could you see a crisis in China where China goes from a success story to experiencing significant turbulence? And I say this because in 1980, had we been sitting here and somebody said to us, the Soviet Union would unravel and it would unravel peacefully, and there'd be a new world order, we would have said, that is impossible. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen to China, but we talk about China's rise, but could you see significant instability or problems within China? And how would that occur in your view?
It's an interesting question because, as I said, China has built a surveillance state, which is the envy of putative autocrats around the world. And this was done by a ruling party which presumably knows China. And that party now depends on performance legitimacy, since it's no longer ideology as it was in the 50s and 60s under Mao. So any drastic economic slowdown must be a worry, particularly at a time when the external environment has turned hostile. I mean, the Chinese leadership seems convinced on what they're saying that the US and the West seek to contain China and to prevent her rise. Given the fact that it's a Leninist one-party state, run by the Communist Party, the mechanism through which crises in the past have been generated and settled in the PRC has been infighting within the leadership of the party itself. But few of the signs of these processes are obvious or visible to outsiders like us, until some Chinese participant wants them to be. That's the way it's worked in the past. So today, they're not visible to us. So when you say, can you see it happening? I don't see the signs today, but I wouldn't see the signs even if they were there, because we're not at that stage. So I can't rule it out. I keep it as one of the possible futures. And this is why I say uncertainty is so high.
Spoken like a true diplomat. Very well.
But this is what I would look for. I would look for signs of infighting in the leadership. I would look for, but let me go back just one step. China operates and has traditionally operated on the relative balance of power. She operates one way where she feels powerful. She operates another way where the balance is against her. So a lot of what we are predicting for Chinese behavior, or to make blanket statements that China is reckless or that China is always cautious, none of these statements can ever be true. And this is true historically. I mean, look at her relationship with the US. As long as she was convinced that the US was much, much more powerful, she worked very closely with the US under Deng and under Jiang Zemin and even under Hu Jintao. After the global financial crisis of 2008, when rightly or wrongly, many Chinese concluded that the West was in terminal decline and so was the US, she changed her behavior towards the US. So for me, it's not so much a quest for order or balance, or it's about using the relative balance of power that she perceives to pursue her interests.
Understood.
And that she's made quite clear what her interests are, I think.
Understood. Kishore, storm clouds on the horizon for China, do you see any? Or are you on balance quite bullish, as I take it you generally have been? Correct me if I'm wrong about that.
No, actually, I don't disagree with many of the things that Shankar has said earlier. There are also, of course, massive uncertainties for China too. And I think it's a mistake to make straight line projections, frankly, for any country in the world. You were saying in 1980, would we have predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union? Of course, we wouldn't have. But of course, in 1980, if you had asked, would the United States elect a president like Donald Trump, who says America first and tells the rest of the world to go to hell, you would have said, no way. The United States is a responsible stakeholder of the global system. If you had said in 1980 the United States would be frightened of signing free trade agreements, you would have said, no way. The United States at that time was the greatest defender of free trade and free trade agreements. So if you had said in 1980, would the United States walk away from the World Trade Organization? You said, no way. The United States believes in trade. So, all these things that were certainties about countries have disappeared. So I think I completely agree with Shankar that we live in a world of massive uncertainties. And I also want to emphasize, to ensure that there's no misunderstanding, that I think the term benevolent great power is an oxymoron. All great powers will, by definition, take care of their interests first. And the Chinese have practiced statecraft for over 4,000 years, and this is what Kissinger documents in his book on China. So the Chinese are good practitioners of knowing how to act when they are weak, as Shankar said, and how to act when they are strong. And Shankar is absolutely right. The Chinese have a very hierarchical view of the world. Let's be very clear of the world, and all the neighbors then have to learn to live and adjust in this hierarchical world. And if you are equally strong as China, as India can be, India can deal with China as equals. But I suspect many of the smaller countries have to learn to live with a more powerful China. Now, on the question of storm clouds, and I completely agree that China faces remarkable domestic challenges. I mean, in the short term, they face this challenge of getting out of zero COVID, and then they have a political transition coming up in October and November, and then they have demographic issues. Yes, all that is true. But I think over the next 10 to 20 years, given the fact that Chinese have, if there's one country that has developed a governance system that works and responds well to governance challenges, I would say is the Chinese political system is one of the most strongest and most resilient governance systems in the world. So I think in
So
the
would you
next
say that
10 to
about the
20
COVID
years,
crisis as well?
sorry?
Would you say that about the COVID crisis as well?
Yes, I think in the first, remember that so far we've had 3 years of COVID. Nah? In 2020 and 2021, China outperformed the world in managing COVID. That's why they only have 5,000 deaths. And by the way, theirs was the only major world economy to grow positively in 2020. People forget that, which is a remarkable feat, as well as in 2021. 2022 has been a bad year for China, really bad year. And I think it will go down as one of the worst years. But if you ask me to make a prediction over the next 5 years, I would say it's safer to overestimate what China can do. Of course, if it doesn't do it, fine, it fails, okay. But the problem is there's no problem for us if China underperforms. Okay, slows down, fine, let's carry on. But if China overperforms as it has on the same pace as it has over the last 30, 40 years, then you have a real new giant at our doorstep. And let's start preparing on how to deal with this giant. And my main argument is that the best way to ensure you have a stable giant in your neighborhood is not to provoke it as it is waking up. Napoleon famously said, "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." And what we are doing now as this giant is waking up. Sadly, many American policies are provoking it without having a long-term strategy. So it's wiser, therefore, as Bill Clinton said, to entangle China in all kinds of multilateral commitments at various levels, regional, global, and so on and so forth. And then you reach a world where you have a new giant on the world scene, but a new giant that understands that it's got to frankly work with the rest and obey the same rules. But that to do that, the leading power today, United States, has to set an example. And unfortunately, as you know, when it comes to multilateralism, the United States still cannot find a multilateral organization that it loves.
Let's shift gears, shall we, and move to the other Asian giant, namely India. Start with you this time, Kishore. During the Cold War, the Indian US relationship was at best correct most of the time, sometimes fractious. India's non alignment was viewed with great suspicion by Washington. Washington's embrace of Pakistan and thereafter China was viewed by great suspicion by India. Now there is increasing talk of a strategic partnership. Just in the last 10 years, if I had to count on my fingers the number of Indian delegations of diplomats and military officials that have come through Washington, it's been quite extraordinary. So, what's happening to this relationship, which was strained and is now moving toward what some call a strategic partnership? Some whisper possibly an alliance. What's brought about the change, and where is it going?
Well, I'm surprised you're beginning with me because a real expert on India, as you
We're
know, is
alternating.
our good friend Shankar. But I would say what the United States is doing with India is completely predictable. And it is, you don't have to be a geopolitical genius to realize, when the United States decided that the Soviet Union was his number one threat, it decided that Mao was no longer a communist. So you had Nixon embracing Mao Zedong. I mean, come on. If you want to think of two people who are really at opposite ends of the spectrum in every sense of the word, it would be Mao Zedong, the most extreme Maoist, to Nixon, who was the most right wing hawk you can think of. So when a right-wing hawk and a Maoist can come together and fall in love with each other exactly 52 years ago in 1972, it's not because they love each other. It's just purely geopolitical common sense. They wanted China to counterbalance the Soviet Union, and by the way, it succeeded brilliantly. Yeah? They wouldn't have succeeded in bleeding Vietnam and bleeding the Soviet Union in Afghanistan without China's help. So in the same way, when today Russia is not considered the number one threat, but number one threat is China, then of course the United States will go to India, because India is the only country that is big enough to balance China. So they, just as the United States used China against the Soviet Union and then turned on China when China became a threat, and I can assure you that the United States will try to use India against China, perfectly normal. But if India becomes number one, then someday the United States may go back to China and say, oh, oops, India is too big now. Let me turn to China. So this is all simple. This is geopolitical ABC, okay? So it's nothing to do with personalities, nothing to do with nature of countries. It all has to do with the laws of geopolitics.
So, Shankar, to you, I've just finished reading and reviewing a wonderful book by Meenakshi Ahmed, which is an A to Z history of the India-US relationship. And she talks about the role of China. And Kishore has correctly pointed out that China has a great deal to do with this. Is there more to this change in the two countries' relationship? And where do you think it's going? And more specifically, since you've spent a lot of time writing and thinking about this, are there expectations the two sides have going into this that neither will quite be able to deliver on?
Well, I agree with what Kishore said, by the way, that, you know, the shift, the opening to transform India-US relations really came in 1991, when the US stopped seeing India and other issues and countries through the lens of the Soviet Union or its relationship with the Soviet Union. And that really opened the way for the transformation, apart from the fact that India also changed both domestically and in her external policies after 1991 under Narasimha Rao. But that opened the door. In a sense, it's ironic. Today, it's China that's making that same mistake, that looks at other issues, countries, including India, through the lens of its confrontation with the US. But India-US relations, China's always been a factor. And I mean, it went through a period of, and this is true, it's in Meenakshi's book, it's also Tanvi Madan, I think, has documented it in detail during the second Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration, for instance, when China was regarded as a major threat. India and the US cooperated pretty closely on issues like Tibet and so on. And the US chose, because of the China factor, to actually accept the idea that India would stay non-aligned and maintain relations with the Soviets and so on. This changed under Johnson with Vietnam and with the polarization of opinion on the US side, but also with India turning more inwards and socialist under Indira Gandhi. So China has been a factor, but China is not the driving force of India-US relations or the transformation. From an Indian point of view, the US is an essential partner in India's transformation. If India wants to modernize to become what it could be in terms of a secure, prosperous country, we need to work with the US. I mean, the US is a natural partner. The US is also a natural partner in the broader issues which, you know, the Indo-Pacific, the maritime security around us, where we cooperate very closely with the US in counterterrorism, and a whole range of issues where we can see that. So there is congruence apart from China. China provides some glue today because we have a difficult relationship with China. But you will notice that India, in this triangle, India, US, China, as the weakest, has always tried to maintain links with both. Not just with the US or not just with China. And has tried, I mean, in classical, as Kishore just said, classical ABC of strategy, to ensure that its relations with the US and with China are better than their relations with each other. I mean, now that's just simple, straightforward strategic logic. And it's not very difficult to do given the present state of China-US relations. But we don't know how long that will last. because frankly, China and the US are joined at the hip. And in many ways, the economic and other connections between them are really important to each of their stability. It doesn't matter whether so there's more to China-US relations than just confrontation. And it's the same with India's relationship with China and with China. Last year, despite what happened on the border and the tension, was our biggest trading partner. So this is a much more complex interaction than a simple binary, sort of choice would suggest. Uh, I Where it will develop is very hard to say, quite frankly. And a lot of it will depend on internal politics in all three countries. Because whether it's the US or whether it's in India or in China after the 20th Party Congress, let's see. But for me, this is a triangle which is well worth watching because it's going to keep evolving. Uh, and it's not ever going to be just a straightforward. I think India recognizes that the US is a global superpower and therefore has all kinds of other interests at play as well at the same time. So therefore, we talk of partnership, not of alliance. And we talk of congruence and of concentrating on those areas where we are congruent. But we're not identical in our views. Certainly on Ukraine, for instance, you can see the difference. And so it's going to be an interesting play, actually, over the next few years.
Yeah. Shankar, let me ask you one question. I recently heard Kishore give a talk or an interview. I can't remember. He's so prolific and so much in demand. I can't keep track of him. It's always wonderful to hear what he has to say. He said something such as the Modi government has awoken, and he said this in a very positive way, the animal spirits of India. So, what has been the contribution of, if any, of Mr. Modi and the BJP in the change in US India relations? Or would it have happened as a matter of simple balance of power logic? Is there a BJP piece to this that we need to understand?
Uh, I am not sure that we need to, you know, look at, if you look at this transformation, it's been going on since, uh, but certainly since the mid 90s onwards, under US presidents who were as varied as Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and now President Biden. I mean, that's a pretty wide range of personalities we're talking about there.
Indeed.
In India as well, under Vajpayee, under Manmohan Singh, under Prime Minister Modi. So for me, it's not so much personality driven as the fact that Indian society, economy, and the polity itself has evolved to the point where it is capable of working with the US in many more ways than it was before. And I think that's the big difference. So today we can do things together, which we couldn't do 25 years ago.
Correct.
So it's the strategic congruence and the capability that we have now, which I think drives this. I mean, every politician will take the credit for what happens on his watch and will blame everything bad that happens on his predecessor or successor. And that's normal. That's a law of politics. But I'm less convinced that it's personality driven in this case because it has gone through different administrations, different governments, different political parties in power and has been consistent right through the global financial crisis, the pandemic, you name it, it's still going on.
Kishore, I want to give you a chance to explain to the audience what you meant when you said, and I believe you were channeling Joseph Schumpeter, that the Modi government has awoken the animal spirits of India. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, I think I am struck by the fact that I'll be very frank with you. I actually felt very sad when India decided not to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because I thought that this free trade agreement, and I'm still convinced that RCEP is going to become the biggest locomotive that is going to drive global economic growth over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, that's to illustrate my point. The European Union has a GNP of 15 trillion, and ASEAN has a combined GNP of 3 trillion. Now, if I ask you in the last 10 years, did the European Union or ASEAN contribute more to global economic growth? The answer should, of course, be European Union is much bigger. But the correct answer is ASEAN. ASEAN delivered more global economic growth than the European Union did. Why? Because ASEAN has been busy signing free trade agreements with everybody. And there's one country that is the most competitive country in economic terms, is India. And you want to know how competitive Indians are, just go to the United States. The single most successful ethnic group in the most competitive human laboratory in the world, which is the United States, are Indians. Only Indians can run Google, only Indians can run Microsoft. So clearly Indians are naturally competitive and can do very well. So when India decided to walk away from the RCEP, I felt very sad. So I said, my God, India is not going to do well. But to my absolute surprise, when I talk to my friends in India, they're incredibly bullish about India's economic prospects. Because what Prime Minister Modi has delivered is a certain degree of predictability and stability in the economic environment of India. And so he's made the various reforms that have gone through, the GST reforms, the ability to deliver direct mobile payments to 500 million Indian women, and all these reforms. The effects of these reforms is having a very positive effect on the Indian psyche. And at the end of the day, when people invest for the future, they must first of all feel confident for the future. If you don't feel confident, you're not going to invest. And the confidence in the future that has developed in India is actually quite remarkable. And I can tell you personally, I invested money in India and did very well. It was my best investment. So I had a first-hand direct impact from India's economic growth. So I'm actually in the next 10 years, I'm very bullish about the new CIA, which is going to drive world history. And the new CIA is China, India, and ASEAN. 1.4 billion people in China, 1.3 billion people in India, and 700 million people in ASEAN. And there is a kind of economic growth requires a kind of a psychological momentum. People don't seem to understand. And that psychological momentum is very much there in China, India, and ASEAN. Whereas by contrast, if you go to Europe, by the way, young people in Europe are very pessimistic for their future. They don't believe that they will have better lives than their parents. They'll have good lives, but it won't be anything like what their parents had in terms of economic growth and so on and so forth. So that's what India is contributing. So I think India's economic growth, and India, by the way, does have free trade agreements with ASEAN and with Australia now, and so therefore India will still be part of the big growth story of the region. So I'm actually bullish on India.
You said you did well on your investments. I may write to you for some stock tips, by the by.
No, I invested in a fund. I'll be very direct with you so you understand what I mean. 7 years ago, I invested something like $200,000 in a fund in India, and I got back $600,000. That's a very good rate of return, okay?
Indeed so. So let's shift directions a little bit. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, aka the Quad, consisting of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. Each member of the Quad says this has nothing to do with China. This is not an anti-Chinese alliance. It's not even an alliance. Chinese have a rather less charitable view of it, as do the Russians. The Chinese have called it an attempt to create an Asian NATO. So tell us, what is the Quad? What is its purpose? And if it is to deal with a host of multilateral regional problems, wouldn't that argue for including China in the Quad? Let me start with you, Shankar, and then move to Kishore.
Well, the Quad is what it says it is. It's a security dialogue that is evolving. It was formed through spontaneous action in response not to China, but to the December 26, 2004 tsunami. of Indonesia. And since then, because these were the four navies that actually responded immediately, were present, and helped with the humanitarian effort. And since then, it's evolved as a much broader vehicle to pursue the common interests of its four members in a free and open Indo-Pacific, right through maritime Asia. And it has worked with others to evolve into becoming a provider of some public goods, vaccines, resilient supply chains it's working on, and maritime security, of course. So shouldn't it work with China? Ideally, yes, but China seems to have taken offense at it after first dismissing it, by the way. I mean, Wang Yi described it as foam on the sea and saying it didn't mean anything. But now suddenly it's become serious in the Chinese telling, as you said, as a potential Asian NATO. Now, it's certainly not a nation NATO today. And it will only become a nation NATO if China's behavior appears so threatening to the others that they see a nation NATO as necessary. But I assume that the Chinese are rational and will not allow that kind of situation to come to pass.
But it's
So
fair to say that it wouldn't have arisen had it not been for the rise of China as a major power in the region and in the world, correct?
I think it started as a dialogue on maritime security at a time when it looked as though one of the consequences of China's claims in the South China Sea was to bring some question marks about maritime security through the Indo-Pacific. And because we were seeing a considerable buildup of naval forces and offensive weapons like submarines across the region, not just China. China may be the biggest, but certainly others as well. So it was natural that these first the navies and then the governments would start discussing these issues and coordinate and see what they could do. But they realized very soon that this wasn't just purely a defense security issue, that they needed to look at the broader context and work with others. I remember Prime Minister Modi was at the Shangri-La dialogue when he spoke of his view of what the Indo-Pacific should be like, and spoke of it being inclusive, as you said, and that there was room here to work with everybody. But for the time being, at least, I think China has chosen to regard the Quad certainly as somehow offensive to her interests, and by calling it a nation NATO and so on, I think has made it difficult for her to cooperate with the Quad. That doesn't stop the Quad from working with other people, but I do think that the Quad will keep evolving. It's still fairly fluid. It's only recently reached the summit level, and it will respond to the situation as these countries see it. And the more they see a need for this kind of concerted action, the more threatened they feel, the more the Quad will be formalized, institutionalized, and will take more harder security direction. If they don't, it won't. I mean, it responded to what it saw as a pandemic with the vaccines, and resilient supply chains. It's responding to the situation. So, and I think that's useful. I think it should stay open, flexible, and
Understood.
that's really the way for it to evolve.
Understood. When you have good conversation, time flies. Gentlemen, we have about 5 minutes, but I want to give Kishore a chance. Kishore, your views on the Quad, your views of China's views on the Quad?
Well, number one, I make three quick points because the clock is running out. Number one, I think it's the sovereign right of four countries, United States, India, Australia, Japan, to form an association with each other. And no one should deny them the right to do so. But at the same time, in terms of perceptions of what the Quad stands for, the reason why many countries in East Asia are reluctant to join it or are not rushing to join Quad. Some organizations everybody wants to join, some organizations people don't want to join. In the case of the Quad, most people perceive it as an anti-China initiative. I mean, that's just how it is perceived. Whether it's right or wrong, you can argue, but that's the perception. And anybody knows if you join the Quad, you'll be perceived to be anti-China, which is why, as you know, South Korea, which is an ally of the United States, hasn't joined it. Otherwise, if South Korea joins it, you can call it the Squad. But South Korea decided not to join it. But the most important point I want to make here is that China also has to understand that its remarkable rise over the last 20, 30 years has clearly affected its neighbors and to some extent alarmed its neighbors too. I mean, it's quite natural. I mean, you've been living with a neighbor and the neighbor suddenly grows 10 times in size. Okay, I mean, China's GNP was 1/10 of the United States in PPP terms in 1980. Now is in PPP terms bigger than the United States. So obviously the neighbors get concerned and alarmed. We have a new giant in our neighborhood. And I think one thing that China should do more of is to reassure its neighbors that actually it has no ambitions to try and be expansionist, to try and intrude into the territories, to try and control them, to try and dominate them, And so that's an effort that I think China is going to make in a much harder way, which I think has been difficult for China because psychologically, surprisingly, the Chinese still see themselves as a developing country and they say, we haven't arrived. But actually, they have arrived as a great power. And I think they should make a bigger effort to assure the neighbors they can get along. And my best case hope is that the ASEAN countries and China overall have worked out a wonderful modus vivendi with each other. And as a result of that, in the year 2000, United States trade with ASEAN was $135 billion and China's trade with ASEAN was only $40 billion, less than 1/3 United States. Today, US trade with ASEAN is just over $300 billion, but China's trade with ASEAN is almost $800 billion.
Forgive me
So
for interrupting.
we worked out a positive arrangement with China for the most part, with lots of challenges. But I think that model of getting along with China, so you have two competing models in some way. One is the Quad model, and then one is the ASEAN-China model. And hopefully, the ASEAN-China model can work for others too.
Understood. Gentlemen, we are out of time. Ambassador Professor Shivshankar Menon, Ambassador Professor Kishore Mahbubani, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Polaris Live. And to our global audience, thank you for watching. Sarwar Kashmeri will be back in the host chair soon. Thanks to both of you. And thanks again to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Once again to our audience, thank you for watching.